The chainsaws started at 7:12 in the morning, and by sunset the entire neighborhood had already made the worst mistake in its history. I remember the exact time because the sound woke me up before my alarm did. At first I thought one of the county maintenance crews was working along the road near the lake. Then I heard a second chainsaw, then a third. The noise echoed across the water and through the open bedroom window like a warning. My name is Ethan Walker, and when I stepped onto my back porch that morning, I watched 100 years of history fall apart one branch at a time. The air smelled like fresh sawdust before I even reached the yard. Workers in bright safety vests stood around the massive oak tree that had dominated the shoreline for longer than anyone in the neighborhood had been alive. The trunk measured nearly 8 feet across. Its branches stretched over the hillside and cast shade across the property every summer afternoon. My grandfather used to call it the guardian of the cove. My father called it the oldest resident in the county. To most people, it was just a tree. To my family, it was a landmark, a memory, a piece of home. I walked down the slope toward the shoreline as another section crashed onto the ground. The workers avoided eye contact. They were simply doing a job. The real problem stood 50 yards away near the property line. Patricia Monroe, HOA President, perfectly pressed beige blazer, clipboard tucked beneath one arm, satisfied smile on her face. She looked less like someone overseeing construction and more like someone celebrating a victory. The lake behind her reflected the early morning sunlight in bright silver streaks. Several residents had gathered along the shoreline to watch. Some even applauded when one of the larger branches came down. I still remember hearing someone say the view was finally opening up. Another person joked that property values were about to increase. Patricia nodded as if she had personally improved the entire community. The strange part was that I was not angry. Not immediately. Confused, yes. Shocked, absolutely. But anger never arrived. Instead, something else settled in. Curiosity. Because Patricia seemed far too confident. Almost rehearsed. Like she believed she had solved a problem. I asked one of the workers who authorized the project. He handed me a permit packet. Everything appeared legitimate at first glance. Approval signatures. Maintenance justifications. Landscape improvement language. The usual paperwork. Yet as I flipped through the pages, one detail stood out. The permit discussed aesthetics, visibility, community appearance. It never mentioned drainage, soil stability, environmental review. Not once. That omission caught my attention immediately because environmental engineering had been my profession for nearly 20 years. Trees that old affect more than scenery. They affect entire systems. Water flow, soil retention, runoff management, ecosystems. As the final section of the oak hit the ground, a silence settled over the shoreline. Even the birds seemed gone. The giant canopy that had shaded the cove for generations was simply gone. Patricia walked over and told me residents would finally enjoy an unobstructed lake view. Then she smiled and left. I stood beside the stump long after everyone else disappeared. The smell of freshly cut wood lingered in the air while sunlight reached parts of the shoreline that had not seen direct exposure in decades. That was when I remembered something my grandfather told me when I was 12 years old. We were sitting beneath that same oak on a summer afternoon when he pointed toward the lake and said, "No matter what happens, never let anyone remove this tree." At the time, I thought he was being sentimental. Standing there beside the stump, I realized he had sounded worried. And for the first time all day, I started wondering what he knew that nobody else did. The neighborhood celebrated for almost a week. Every evening, I watched residents gather along the shoreline to admire what Patricia called the improved lake view. Folding chairs appeared where the oak's shade once covered the grass. People brought drinks and cameras. Some even posted photographs on the community message board praising the transformation. Patricia became something of a local hero. During the next HOA meeting, she stood in front of a projector screen displaying before and after images of the shoreline. The room filled with applause. According to her presentation, removing the tree had increased visibility, improved aesthetics, and enhanced property values. She spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the discussion was already finished. I sat quietly near the back of the room and listened. The smell of coffee drifted through the clubhouse, while ceiling fans rotated overhead. Every few minutes, Patricia pointed toward another photograph and accepted another compliment. Nobody asked about drainage. Nobody asked about environmental impact. Nobody asked why a tree older than the neighborhood itself had suddenly become a problem. That silence interested me more than anything Patricia said. After the meeting ended, several neighbors approached to offer condolences. Most assumed I was upset because of sentimental attachment. They were not wrong. Every memory of my childhood seemed connected to that tree. Family picnics, fishing trips with my father, summer afternoons spent reading beneath the shade. Yet what bothered me most was not emotional. It was technical. The oak sat in a location no engineer would ignore. Its root system stretched deep beneath the hillside between the lake and several residential lots. Trees that old interact with water flow in ways most people never consider. Remove one, and the landscape does not simply change appearance. It changes behavior. 2 days later, I climbed into the attic of my house, searching for something I had not looked at in years. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight, while old storage boxes lined the wooden floor. Near the back wall, I found a metal filing cabinet that belonged to my grandfather. Most people would have thrown it away decades ago. I never did. Inside were property records, survey maps, handwritten notes, and engineering documents dating back generations. The smell of aged paper filled the air as I opened folder after folder. Hours passed. Then I found it. A folded county survey map dated more than 40 years earlier. The shoreline looked different back then. Several parcel boundaries had changed over time, but one detail remained exactly the same. The oak tree. Someone had marked it by hand using red ink. A circle surrounded the symbol. Beside it appeared a note written in my grandfather's handwriting. I immediately recognized the lettering. My pulse quickened as I unfolded additional pages. More references appeared. Drainage easement, water retention study, environmental exemption. The terminology became increasingly specific. By sunset, papers covered nearly every surface in my living room. Outside, golden light reflected across the lake where residents continued enjoying their newly opened view. Inside, I sat surrounded by decades of forgotten records. That was when I discovered the first clue my grandfather had tried to preserve. The oak was not important because it was beautiful. It was important because county regulators had built an entire classification around its existence. And according to the documents now spread across my table, the moment that tree disappeared, a very different set of rules became active. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the red circle drawn around the oak tree on that decades-old survey map. The image stayed with me because it made no sense. Engineers do not highlight a single tree on a county planning document without a reason. Somewhere inside those folders was an explanation, and by sunrise I was already back at the dining room table sorting through records. The smell of old paper mixed with fresh coffee while sunlight slowly filled the room. Outside, the lake looked calm. Residents walked dogs along the shoreline path. Boats drifted across the water. The neighborhood appeared peaceful. Yet hidden inside a stack of forgotten files was information capable of changing everything people believed about that tree. Around mid-morning, I found another folder marked with my grandfather's handwriting. The label simply read Shoreline Project. Inside were meeting notes, environmental reports, engineering sketches, and correspondence with county officials stretching back nearly 30 years. As I read through the documents, a story began emerging. Long before our neighborhood existed, the cove had experienced serious runoff issues during heavy storms. Water collected in low areas, overflowed into nearby properties, and created seasonal drainage problems. Several solutions were proposed over the years. Retention basins, water diversion channels, stormwater infrastructure. Most were expensive and unpopular. Then environmental consultants discovered something unusual. The massive oak and its surrounding root system were performing part of the work naturally. The tree stabilized the hillside. It slowed runoff. It reduced erosion. More importantly, it allowed the area to qualify for a special environmental management designation that eliminated the need for certain infrastructure projects. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the report for several seconds. Suddenly, my grandfather's warning made sense. He was never protecting the tree because of sentiment. He was protecting it because the tree was holding an entire regulatory framework together. My pulse quickened as I continued reading. Additional documents referenced annual inspections, soil monitoring, drainage evaluations. Then I found the phrase that changed everything. Conditional exemption. The designation appeared repeatedly throughout multiple reports. According to the county records, several costly water management requirements remained suspended because specific environmental conditions existed on the property. One of those conditions was the presence of the oak tree and the biological system connected to it. I immediately opened my laptop and searched current county regulations. Hours disappeared as I compared old records with modern requirements. The legal language had evolved over time, but the underlying structure remained surprisingly similar. If certain environmental conditions disappeared, county agencies could reassess drainage classifications and require alternative compliance measures. Alternative compliance measures. The words sounded harmless. They were not. By late afternoon, I drove to the county planning office. The building smelled faintly of printer toner and old carpet. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls behind public service counters. After submitting a records request, I spent nearly 2 hours reviewing archived maps and engineering studies. Every new document confirmed the same conclusion. The oak was not merely part of the landscape. It was part of a system Patricia never bothered to investigate before removing it. As I left the building, the sun hung low above the horizon. Orange light reflected off the lake as I pulled into my driveway. Across the shoreline, residents continued enjoying their newly opened view. Patricia stood with a small group near the clubhouse, laughing and pointing toward the water. They looked proud of what they had accomplished. None of them noticed the thick folder resting on the passenger seat beside me. None of them knew that buried inside county archives was a clause capable of transforming their victory into a problem far larger than a missing tree. And for the first time since the chainsaws arrived, I finally understood exactly why my grandfather had been worried all those years ago. The next morning, I stopped thinking like a homeowner and started thinking like an engineer. Emotion had helped me understand why the tree mattered. Regulations would determine what happened next. I spent hours reviewing county codes, environmental assessments, and shoreline management policies. The deeper I looked, the more one phrase kept appearing throughout decades of records. Conditional exemption. Every document seemed connected to it. The exemption was not attached to me personally. It was not attached to my family. It was attached to the environmental conditions surrounding the cove. And one of those conditions had just been removed with a chainsaw. Rain arrived 2 days later. Nothing dramatic. Just a steady spring storm rolling across the lake. I sat near the window with a notebook while dark clouds drifted overhead. Water collected along the shoreline exactly where the old reports predicted it would. Small streams began flowing downhill toward the cove. Areas that had remained stable for years suddenly looked different. By evening, patches of soil near the former oak site appeared softer than usual. The change was subtle, but it was there. The landscape was already responding. Meanwhile, Patricia continued enjoying her victory tour. The community newsletter featured photographs of the newly opened shoreline. Several residents praised the unobstructed lake view. During another HOA gathering, Patricia described the project as one of the board's greatest improvements. She spoke confidently about appearance, property values, and community satisfaction. Not once did she mention environmental review. Not once did she mention drainage classification. Not once did she mention county compliance requirements. I almost admired the confidence. Almost. A week later, I requested a formal consultation with a county environmental planner. The meeting took place in a modest office overlooking a parking lot filled with county vehicles. Maps covered the walls. Large aerial photographs hung in metal frames. I brought copies of every historical document I had discovered. The planner spent nearly an hour reviewing the records. Occasionally he nodded. Occasionally he highlighted sections with a yellow marker. Finally, he set the folder aside and looked directly at me. His expression changed. It was not surprise. It was recognition. He had seen situations like this before. The planner explained that environmental exemptions are often based on specific site conditions. If those conditions disappear, agencies are required to reassess compliance requirements. The process is not personal. It is automatic. Rules simply follow facts. Then he asked a question that made me sit up straighter in my chair. Has anyone submitted updated site documentation since the tree was removed? I told him no. He nodded slowly. That answer seemed important. Before I left, he handed me several forms related to environmental status reviews and shoreline compliance updates. Nothing about the paperwork looked dramatic. Plain pages, standard procedures, routine government forms. Yet I understood exactly what they represented. The beginning of a process. the same kind of process that had quietly protected the neighborhood for decades. As I drove home, the late afternoon sun reflected off the lake in brilliant shades of gold and orange. Residents continued enjoying their expanded view. Children rode bicycles along the shoreline path. Boats drifted across calm water. Everything looked perfect, but perfection can be deceptive, because hidden beneath the surface of that beautiful scene was a regulatory clock that had already started ticking. That evening, I completed the forms at my dining room table. Every answer came directly from county records. Every statement was supported by documentation. No accusations, no arguments, no complaints about Patricia, just facts. By the time I signed the final page, I realized something important. I was not starting a fight with the HOA. I was simply informing the system that the conditions protecting the neighborhood no longer existed. And once the system received that information, it would do exactly what it had been designed to do. The county acknowledged my submission 11 days later. The notification arrived by certified mail on a bright Thursday afternoon. I still remember the sound of the mailbox door closing as I walked back toward the house holding the envelope. It looked ordinary. White paper, government seal, standard formatting. Yet I knew exactly what it represented. The process had officially started. Inside, the letter confirmed that County Environmental Services would conduct a site reassessment based on documented changes to shoreline conditions. The language was polite, clinical, completely free of emotion. Government agencies rarely care about personal disputes. They care about compliance. That distinction was about to become very important. 2 inspectors arrived the following week. The morning air carried the smell of damp soil from a recent rainstorm. Their truck parked near the shoreline shortly after 8 o'clock. They spent hours examining the area where the oak once stood, measuring elevations, reviewing drainage patterns, comparing current conditions against historical records. I watched from a distance while taking notes. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. It was simply a technical evaluation, the kind Patricia never imagined would happen. By lunchtime, several curious residents had gathered nearby. Most assumed the county was conducting a routine inspection. Patricia even walked down to the shoreline carrying a coffee cup and wearing her usual confident smile. She greeted the inspectors warmly and spent several minutes explaining how much residents appreciated the improved view. One inspector listened politely before returning his attention to a tablet computer displaying maps and environmental data. The conversation ended quickly. Facts tend to be more persuasive than opinions. 3 days later, another letter arrived. This one contained language I had been expecting ever since I discovered my grandfather's files. The county had completed its preliminary review. The environmental conditions supporting the previous exemption no longer existed. As a result, the cove and surrounding drainage area would undergo full compliance reevaluation under current stormwater management requirements. I read the letter twice before setting it down. Then I read it a third time. Outside, children played along the shoreline path while boats drifted across the lake. The neighborhood still looked exactly the same. Yet on paper, everything had changed. The next HOA meeting felt different from the moment it began. Residents packed the clubhouse. Folding chairs filled every available space. The smell of coffee and fresh copies drifted through the room. Patricia opened the meeting with her usual confidence, but whispers spread through the audience before she even reached the first agenda item. People had seen county vehicles. They had noticed inspectors. Questions were beginning to circulate. About halfway through the meeting, one resident asked whether the recent environmental review had anything to do with the tree removal project. Patricia immediately dismissed the concern. She described the inspection as routine and insignificant. Several people nodded. Others looked unconvinced. I remained silent. There was no need to argue. The paperwork was already moving. The following week brought the document that changed the entire conversation. A formal county assessment report, nearly 60 pages long. Charts, maps, soil analysis, drainage projections, compliance recommendations. Buried deep within the report sat the conclusion that mattered most. Without the environmental conditions previously provided by the oak ecosystem, the area no longer qualified for exemption status. Alternative mitigation infrastructure would eventually be required. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the report. Then I noticed something remarkable. The proposed infrastructure zone covered exactly the section of shoreline Patricia had spent weeks celebrating. The same view residents had applauded. The same view showcased in HOA newsletters. The same view they believed had been improved forever. As evening sunlight reflected across the lake outside my window, I closed the report and smiled for the first time since the chainsaws arrived. Because the county had finally reached the same conclusion my grandfather understood decades ago. The tree had never been the obstacle. The tree had been the solution. The report spread through the neighborhood faster than any HOA newsletter ever had. Within days, residents who had applauded the removal of the oak were suddenly reading environmental summaries and county recommendations. The atmosphere shifted almost overnight. Conversations that once focused on lake views now centered on drainage requirements, compliance obligations, and something called alternative mitigation infrastructure. Most people had never heard those terms before. Patricia certainly had not mentioned them during her presentations. One Saturday morning, I walked along the shoreline and noticed groups of neighbors gathered near the clubhouse discussing copies of the county assessment. The smell of freshly cut grass drifted through the air while sprinklers clicked rhythmically across nearby lawns. On the surface, everything still looked peaceful. Beneath that calm exterior, concern was growing. The assessment report did not order immediate construction. It did something more important. It established that the previous exemption no longer applied. Once that conclusion became official, county planners were required to evaluate long-term solutions. That process had already begun. 2 weeks later, another public meeting was scheduled. This one was hosted by County Environmental Services rather than the HOA. The turnout surprised everyone. Residents filled every seat inside the municipal conference room. Additional chairs lined the walls. Some people stood near the back. Maps covered display boards throughout the room. Technical diagrams projected onto large screens. Engineers answered questions while planners reviewed historical records. Patricia arrived wearing the same confident expression she always carried into HOA meetings. But confidence looks different when the audience is asking questions you cannot answer. As presentations began, county staff explained the history of the shoreline area. They discussed runoff management, erosion control, environmental classifications, and exemption requirements. Then one slide appeared on the screen showing a historical aerial image. The oak stood prominently near the shoreline. A county engineer pointed toward it and explained how the tree's ecosystem had contributed to maintaining compliance conditions for decades. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Many residents had assumed the tree was decorative. They were learning that it had served a practical function all along. Then came the moment that changed everything. The engineer revealed several conceptual mitigation options currently under review. Retention systems, drainage improvements, water treatment features, stormwater management infrastructure. One rendering displayed a large engineered pond occupying a significant portion of the shoreline corridor. The room fell silent. Even before the explanation finished, people understood what they were looking at. The pond was not designed for beauty. It was designed for compliance. Water collection, treatment, runoff control, function over appearance. The location highlighted on the rendering overlapped the exact section of shoreline Patricia had fought so hard to open for scenic views. I glanced across the room. For the first time since this story began, Patricia looked genuinely unsettled. She raised several objections. Questions about aesthetics, property values, community impact. County officials listened politely before explaining the same thing repeatedly. The options existed because environmental conditions had changed. Regulations required responses. Nobody in the room mentioned blame. Nobody needed to. The documents spoke for themselves. As the meeting ended, residents gathered around the display boards studying maps and engineering drawings. Outside, evening sunlight reflected across the lake while a warm breeze moved through the trees that remained along the shoreline. I stood quietly observing the crowd. Months earlier, Patricia had convinced everyone that removing the oak represented progress. Now those same residents were learning the true cost of that decision. Driving home, I passed the empty space where the tree once stood. The stump remained visible above the grass, weathered by rain and sunlight. Looking at it, I finally understood why my grandfather preserved all those records. He knew some things are valuable because of what they provide. Others are valuable because of what they prevent. And the county was getting closer every day to proving exactly what that old oak had been preventing. The official letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. By then, most residents already suspected what was coming. Rumors had spread through the neighborhood for weeks. Every county meeting, every engineering review, every new report pointed toward the same conclusion. The shoreline exemption was gone. Something would replace it. The only remaining question was what? I was standing in my kitchen when the envelope arrived. Sunlight streamed through the windows and reflected across the hardwood floor while the coffee maker hummed quietly in the background. The letter looked identical to every other piece of county correspondence I had received during the previous months. Yet the moment I opened it, I knew this one mattered. The first page contained the formal determination. Environmental reassessment completed. Compliance review finalized. Mitigation requirements approved. I read each sentence carefully. Then I reached the section describing the selected solution. After months of studies, inspections, and engineering evaluations, the county had chosen a long-term water management project for the cove. The plan included a retention and treatment system designed to manage runoff, improve water quality, and satisfy modern environmental standards. The location map attached to the report left no room for interpretation. The project would occupy the exact shoreline corridor where residents had celebrated their new lake view. I sat at the table for several minutes staring at the documents. Not because I was surprised, because the prediction my grandfather preserved decades earlier had finally become reality. That evening, the HOA scheduled an emergency meeting. The clubhouse parking lot filled before sunset. Residents arrived carrying copies of county reports and printed maps. Conversations echoed across the room long before the meeting officially started. Patricia stood near the front reviewing notes with several board members. For the first time since the oak disappeared, she looked uncertain. The confidence that once defined every public appearance had begun to crack. As the meeting opened, questions arrived immediately. Residents wanted explanations. Why had nobody reviewed environmental consequences before removing the tree? Why had county compliance issues never been discussed? Why had the board focused only on appearance? Patricia attempted to defend the original decision. She spoke about aesthetics, visibility, and community feedback. But the room had changed. Months earlier, those arguments worked. Now people were holding engineering reports in their hands. Facts had replaced assumptions. The discussion continued for nearly 2 hours. Voices remained civil, but frustration filled the room. Every answer seemed to create another question. Eventually, someone asked the question nobody could avoid. Could the project still be stopped? The silence that followed felt enormous. Then one county representative attending remotely provided a simple answer. No. The approval process had reached the implementation stage. Compliance requirements were mandatory. The environmental conditions supporting the previous exemption no longer existed. Therefore, mitigation measures would proceed. No emotion, no debate, just procedure. Walking outside afterward, I noticed residents standing along the shoreline looking across the water. The evening sky glowed orange and purple above the lake. For years, people had admired that view without understanding what protected it. Now they finally knew. Over the following weeks, survey crews appeared throughout the area. Small flags marked locations. Equipment measured elevations. Engineers documented drainage patterns. Every step followed regulations established long before Patricia ever became HOA president. One afternoon, I stopped beside the old stump and placed my hand against the weathered wood. The surface felt rough beneath my fingers. I remembered sitting beneath the canopy as a child while my grandfather pointed toward the lake and spoke about responsibilities that outlast generations. At the time, I thought he was talking about family. Standing there now, I realized he was talking about consequences. Because the county had made its decision. The paperwork was complete. The approvals were final. And the landscape Patricia fought so hard to change was about to change far more than she ever imagined. Construction began on a cool Monday morning just after sunrise. The first trucks arrived before most residents left for work. Their engines echoed across the lake while flashing amber lights reflected against the water. I stood on my porch holding a cup of coffee and watched the convoy move toward the shoreline. Survey stakes that had dotted the area for weeks were finally being replaced by heavy equipment. Excavators, utility vehicles, engineering crews. Everything the county approved was now becoming reality. The reaction throughout the neighborhood was immediate. Residents gathered along sidewalks and near the clubhouse parking lot to watch. Some looked curious. Others looked frustrated. Many simply looked stunned. For months they had heard words like mitigation, compliance, and environmental infrastructure. Now those abstract terms were transforming into physical changes they could see. The shoreline that Patricia had promised would remain open and beautiful was becoming an active construction zone. The sound of machinery filled the air from morning until late afternoon. Dust drifted across portions of the lakefront while crews carefully reshaped sections of land identified in the county plans. Despite the scale of the work, everything moved with remarkable precision. Every measurement followed engineering specifications. Every excavation matched approved designs. There was nothing emotional about it. No revenge. No arguments. Just regulations being implemented exactly as written. 2 weeks into construction, the outline of the future retention and treatment basin became visible. Standing on a nearby hill, residents could finally understand the project's size. The structure occupied a substantial section of the corridor where people once gathered to enjoy the newly opened view. Conversations across the neighborhood changed almost overnight. Nobody talked about improved scenery anymore. Instead, people discussed timelines, environmental reports, and whether the project could have been avoided. One evening, I attended a public update meeting hosted by county engineers. The room felt very different from the enthusiastic HOA gatherings that followed the tree removal. There were no celebratory photographs, no applause, no presentations about property values. Instead, engineers explained runoff calculations, water quality objectives, and compliance requirements. Large diagrams displayed the basin's final appearance. The system would collect stormwater, improve treatment capacity, and satisfy modern environmental standards. Function, reliability, compliance. Those were the priorities now. Patricia sat near the front row during the presentation. She remained quiet for most of the evening. Occasionally, she asked questions about visual impact or alternative options. The answers never changed. The selected solution represented the most practical and legally compliant path available after the environmental exemption disappeared. Hearing those words repeated again and again felt almost surreal. Months earlier, nobody wanted to discuss the exemption. Now it dominated every conversation. As summer progressed, the project continued taking shape. The basin gradually filled the landscape. Protective vegetation was installed. Drainage channels appeared. Water management features connected seamlessly with surrounding infrastructure. From an engineering perspective, the work was impressive. From a scenic perspective, it was impossible to ignore. The shoreline looked completely different. One afternoon, I walked to the edge of the construction area just as the sun began setting across the lake. Orange light reflected off shallow water inside the newly completed basin. Birds landed near the edges where fresh vegetation had already begun taking root. The scene was strangely peaceful. Not ugly, not beautiful, simply functional. Exactly what the county intended. Across the water, I noticed several residents standing silently near the clubhouse. They were looking toward the same shoreline Patricia once described as her greatest achievement. Nobody applauded anymore. Nobody talked about unobstructed views. The reality standing before them was impossible to debate. The landscape had changed far more dramatically than a single tree ever could. And every truck, every survey stake, every shovel of soil traced back to the same moment. The morning the chainsaws arrived and removed the one thing that had quietly protected the entire shoreline for generations. Almost a year later, the neighborhood still talked about the tree. Not because it was standing, not because it could be brought back, but because everyone finally understood what it had been doing all along. The construction crews were gone by then. The survey stakes had disappeared. The noise of heavy equipment had faded into memory. In their place sat a fully operational water management basin integrated into the shoreline. Native vegetation lined the edges. Water moved through treatment channels exactly as engineers designed. The system worked perfectly. That was the irony. Nobody could honestly complain about its performance. The project accomplished every environmental objective the county required. It improved runoff control. It enhanced water quality management. It protected the cove. The only thing it did not improve was the view. One autumn evening, I walked down to the shoreline just before sunset. The air felt cool and carried the scent of damp grass from a recent rain. Birds moved through the newly planted vegetation surrounding the basin. Small ripples crossed the surface of the water while golden sunlight reflected across the treatment area. The landscape looked entirely different from the one I grew up with. Yet in a strange way, it was serving the same purpose. protecting the shoreline, managing water, preserving stability. The methods had changed. The responsibility had not. Patricia was no longer HOA president. She resigned several months after the county project reached completion. Officially, her departure had nothing to do with the environmental situation. Unofficially, everyone understood the truth. Residents had lost confidence. Questions about oversight, decision-making, and due diligence continued long after construction ended. New board members approached community issues very differently. They reviewed reports, consulted specialists, asked questions before making decisions. The culture changed, and perhaps that was the most important outcome of all. One afternoon, I received a package containing copies of historical county documents that had been digitized during the review process. Included among them was a scanned version of my grandfather's original survey map. The same red circle surrounded the oak tree. The same handwritten notes appeared in the margins. Sitting at my desk, I studied the faded ink for several minutes. Then I noticed something I had somehow overlooked before. Beneath the environmental references and engineering notes, my grandfather had written a single sentence. It was easy to miss. The handwriting was small and partially faded with age, yet the words remained perfectly readable. Most people only notice what a tree blocks. Few notice what it prevents. I smiled the moment I read it, because that sentence explained the entire story. Patricia saw a tree blocking a view. Residents saw branches blocking scenery. The county eventually saw an ecosystem preventing compliance issues. My grandfather saw all of it decades earlier. As the sun began setting outside my window, I drove one final time to the shoreline. The basin reflected shades of orange and gold beneath the evening sky. Families walked nearby. Children rode bicycles along the path. Life continued. The neighborhood adapted. Communities always do. I stopped beside the weathered stump that still remained near the edge of the property. Grass had begun growing around it. Time was slowly reclaiming the scar left behind. Standing there, I realized I never actually defeated Patricia. I never sued her. I never argued with her. I never launched a campaign against the HOA. All I did was submit accurate information to the people responsible for evaluating it. The rest happened on its own. That is why the ending still feels satisfying. They removed the one thing protecting the shoreline because they wanted a better view. They believed they were improving the neighborhood. They never understood the tree was the reason the neighborhood had that view in the first place. Once it disappeared, the regulations started moving. Once the regulations started moving, nobody could stop them. And in the end, the old oak delivered one final lesson long after it was gone. Nature had been solving a problem for free. The moment that solution disappeared, the bill arrived.